Hi, this is Marlene Dinarius here, and this is the second part of a video on the Cleffs, and we're continuing on. This is Hawkins, an inquiry into the nature and principles of Thoroughbass on a new plan, London 1817. And we're talking about the Cleffs that had a stave of 4 lines and what happened and how the Cleffs were used, or the Cleffs, I would say nowadays. So whoever designed this for that purpose, he took a stave of 4 lines for each, which would afford lines and spaces sufficient in each for 7 notes, the whole compass of musical sounds. Beginning from the lowest note G, this is the lowest sung note in Guido d'Arezzo's Gam Ut. Beginning from the lowest note G and placing that on the lowest line of the stave, A on the first space, B on the second line, C on the second space, D on the third line, E on the third space, and F on the fourth line, it is evident a stave of 4 lines, which was what he intended for the bass, or that for full-grown men, was completed. Again, taking another stave of 4 lines and placing on the lowest line of that the same note F as a repetition, which had been the top line of the bass stave, he added on the first space G, on the second line A, on the second space B, on the third line C, on the third space D, and on the fourth line E. This completed the second or tenor stave, which was that designed for the young men. And choosing, as the notes to be distinguished, those which Guido had before mentioned, C and F, he applied C to the tenor stave. And made use of a character, one we don't see in modern music, originally intended for the Greek letter K, but which has since been corrupted, and is now represented by a form resembling a ladder of 2 steps, or the capital Roman letter H, but with 2 strokes instead of 1 in its center. This, of course, fell on the third line from the bottom, or, which is the same thing, the second from the top, as it now stands, because that was the station of note C. In like manner, he proceeded as to the third stave. Beginning with that E, which had been the top line of the tenor stave, and placing that, as a repetition, on the lowest line of the third stave, consisting, like the others, of 4 lines also. The first or lowest line was E, the first space F, the second line G, the second space A, the third line B, the third space C, and the fourth line D, which completed the third stave, or that for the boys. Against the second line from the bottom, where that note occurred, he placed the clef or characteristic G, and the treble cliff still continues, with some small variation, to resemble that letter. We're still using it nowadays in musical notation. These marks, or characteristics, were called cleffs, from clavis, the Latin word for a key, or in the Old English pronunciation of that word, clavis, which became corrupted to cleffs, and indicated a progression of sounds from gamma, from G, the lowest note in the scale, upwards to E in the third octave above. Which, at the time, seems to have been the whole of the scale, though it has since been greatly extended. Taking the fact to be as it appears, that originally the lines of the stave were but 4, it is to be observed that the lower line of the bass being G, the F clef would fall on the third line above that G, and consequently on the top line of the bass stave. And that, taking that F as the lowest line of the tenor stave, the tenor clef C would fall on the second line above that, or one line below the top line of the tenor stave. And by these means, the top line of the tenor stave would be E. Again, taking that E as the lowest line of the treble stave, the treble clef G would fall on the line above that, or the second lowest in the treble stave, which is exactly the fact, and ascertains the stave to have been settled as consisting of 4 lines. The line at the top of the treble was afterwards added to make the lines 5 and add 2 notes at the top. Another line was also added at the bottom of the tenor stave to make that consist of 5 lines also, and extend that 2 notes below. And at the same time, another line was added at the top of the bass stave, by which that stave became also of 5 lines, like the rest, and was in like manner extended 2 notes at top. The bass stave with F on its 4th line may, with the assistance of 4 legger or additional lines at the bottom, and as many at the top, extend from F to B in the 4th octave above, or, to state it another way, from F 2 octaves below the clef to B in the 3rd octave above. By this method, in other words the legger lines, the bass stave was, in its upper part, made to borrow the lowest notes of the tenor stave. The tenor stave with C on the 2nd line from the top may, with the assistance of 4 legger lines above and as many below the stave extend from C 2 octaves below the clef to F in the second octave above. And as C, the clef is the same note with that C which occurs in the bass stave on the line above the stave. The extent of the tenor stave may be reckoned as commencing with the note C on the second ledger line below the bass stave and ending with F above the second ledger line above the bass stave. The lowest line C is equivalent to the C on the second ledger line below the bass stave, and the uppermost F to that F which occurs on the top line of the treble stave. Thus, the tenor, by means of the 4 ledger lines at the bottom, borrowed the upper notes from the bass stave, and by the means of the 4 ledger lines at the top of the tenor stave, that stave was extended so as to comprehend the lowest notes of the treble stave. The treble stave with G on the second line from the bottom may, with the similar assistance of ledger lines, extend from D in the second or next octave below the clef to G, the conclusion of the next octave but one above it, and as G, the clef is equivalent to that G which occurs on the ledger line above the tenor stave, in the same manner as C. The tenor clef is the same note with that which occurs in a similar situation over the bass stave. It is evident that D, the lowest note on the lowest ledger line below the treble stave, is the same with that D on the lowest line of the tenor stave. The treble stave, in consequence of the addition of the 4 ledger lines below that stave in like manner or similar manner, contained also the uppermost notes of the tenor stave, and by so doing was enabled to form a junction with the uppermost notes in the bass stave, to the utter exclusion of the tenor stave and clef, which is why we no longer see the tenor stave and clef in our modern music. The whole of what has been said here will be perfectly intelligible from consulting the following table, ascertaining the situations and names of all the notes in the 3 parts of bass, tenor, and treble. So this is the table that Hawkins has constructed, and you can see on the left hand side the bass, the stave going from so those are the lines of the stave of the bass as it exists now, with 5 lines, and the ledger lines at the top and the bottom eat into what would have been the tenor clef, and the same with the treble, G being the key note, and the ledger lines at the top and the bottom, or in this case the bottom of the treble, eating into the tenor clef. So the tenor clef has disappeared, arguably making it more difficult to read music than it was before, because now we have to deal with all these ledger lines, whereas previously you just had the 3 clefs and no ledger lines. So, as Hawkins notes, by the use of these ledger lines at the bottom of the treble stave and at the top of the bass stave, by which means the two staves have been made to connect with each other, modern composers have contrived to exclude the tenor clef. And it is true, as has indeed been asserted, that without its assistance, music may be performed on the pianoforte. In consequence of this, it is rarely, if ever, nowadays never, I note, taught to pupils, as it ought to be, so that, when they meet with it introduced as it is by Handel in the basis to his overtures, etc., in order to save room or space and avoid confusion by preventing the necessity for ledger lines, they are unable to read the passages and throw them aside with disgust as incomprehensible. And that brings us to the end of this section of Hawkins on the Cleffs, and now we are going to move into the proper discussion of Thoroughbass and how Thoroughbass works, now that the preambles are over and done with.